Don't forget to give a thumbs up and provide a comment, and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content. For my next project, I've got this piece of maple, and I'm going to turn a platter out of it. It's 2.5 inches thick, and I ended up cutting it so that I've got about 9.5 inches square. So here I have it mounted in my lathe on my worm screw, as I mentioned. And I took it over to the bandsaw and I cut it round, roughly. And it's not too bad, but I will, that's what the lathe specializes in, making things round. But even though it's fairly close, I'll just show you, it's still a bit out of balance. I guess you probably can't see it, but I can feel a bit of vibration even at the slowest speeds. So even though it's fairly round, it still wants to bounce a little bit. It won't take long to make it round, and then we'll move on from there. See, that didn't take very long to make it round at all. Now I'll start working on the bottom of the bowl and the outside of the bowl. While I'm still mounted on my worm screw, it's easiest to do the final shaping of the outside of the bowl in this position. So starting to shape the bottom here. As I mentioned, I'm going to leave a rim on it, so I'm going to have to come quite a bit smaller yet, and this will form the rim. I'll probably make the outside, the rim will be not just cut on the inside, but it'll flare out over the outside. You'll see what I mean by that in a second. So I got a bit more work to do here. I can take that down. It's cutting well. I'm going to continue with what's called a push cut. That's just taking my tool blade this way, and you can see that it leaves this rim here as I push it. I should explain what's happening there, and I've got to be careful because I don't want to catch to ruin the bottom here where I want to be. But sometimes when you first approach the bottom, if it's flat on, it'll want to kind of skip. It's called a catch. It'll skip across. And you can see there I've got a little bit of a scratch. Yet to get the push cut started, you've got to be careful how you introduce it, and you want to introduce it slow until you get the cut started. There, I've smoothed that up, and I've got a nice cut going on there. It's nice and smooth. That surface area would barely need sanding. So here I've just stopped my lathe, and I'm just tightening the bowl up on the worm screw. Because I don't have my tailstock engaged, and because I'm using my tools, sometimes it'll loosen up a little bit on the worm screw. So it's a good idea just every once in a while just to make sure it's tight so that it doesn't get loose or move around. So I should mention, this is my bowl gouge, and I use a combination of bowl gouge and carbide tools. The carbide tools are quicker, a bit easier, more forgiving to use. The bowl gouge, depending on how I present that to the bowl, I can get some very fine cuts. So I'm making shavings that look more like this. Or I can push it in fairly aggressively and get shavings that look like this. Obviously this will be much faster cutting, but not as smooth of a surface as if I'm getting shavings like this. So it's really just on how I hold the tool. It takes a little bit of practice and just getting used to it, but once you do, this is the bowl gouge is a Now I've sanded this off camera. I've sanded it up to 600 grit, but I just wanted to show you, and I think you can see it there in the camera, how much it shines. So that's got no finish on it yet. That's just sanded to 600 grit, and it feels just like glass. There's a little bit here that you see it's a little discolored. It's still smooth. It's a bit of end grain, so it shows a little different. I'll put some sanding sealer on that. That'll just help seal that grain, and then I'll sand it one more time at a very fine grit. But again, no finish on this, and you can see that it's really starting to shine. Here in this shot, you can see the recess. That's what I used here as I flipped it around. That recess goes into my chuck, and now I've re-engaged my tailstock, and I'm starting to hollow out the inside of the bowl. Again, if you look closely, you'll see that I'm just stepping inside to maintain that rim, which will be used later on for the embellishment. Okay, the bowl is hollowed out about as much as I can get it with the tailstock in place. But so with it being hollowed out, a lot of weight has been removed. So I'll go ahead and just take this piece, this nib from the bottom out, flatten the bottom out. I'm as deep as I want to be. Flatten the bottom out, just make a final pass cut on here, and then we'll be ready for the next step. So now with the tailstock out of place, I'll continue to just work the inside, bottom of the bowl, flattening everything out and taking it down to that final depth. So I measure the bottom. I usually just do this by using a tool, putting my fingers in, and that gives me a good idea of where I am. I can also feel it there, it's good. Just smooth this up, and then we'll be ready to start working on the edge. You can see here by the amount of shavings that are coming off, the inside's cutting very, very well. My bowl gouge has given me the best surface here. Again, sometimes it depends on the grain, the wood, the angle, the cut. Sometimes I use my scraper, I get a good job on that. This time around the scraper wasn't doing a good job, but the bowl gouge riding the bevel seemed to give me the best. Now I'm starting to sand the inside of the bowl. I like to use this tool. It allows me to reach inside, and it's got a sponge on it so I can sand contoured surfaces. I'm not sure how much you can see here, but I've only sanded this to, I believe it's 80 grit, 60 grit, and which is very coarse. I wouldn't usually start that coarse, but I've got a couple sections of end grain right here, and of course diagonally opposite of that right there, and sometimes end grain is very difficult to deal with, hard to get sanded. End grain means that the fibers are sticking up this way and they tend to fray. The rest of the bowl is shiny. Where it's not end grain, it's starting to develop some gloss, which is really good. But I'm still getting that end grain, and unfortunately if I put a finish on that right now, they would show up. It feels smooth, but it just would show up almost like a light discoloration. So I'm going to try and sand it a little bit more, just try and get rid of that. And with the end grain, it's also a little low, just because it's frayed off. Those pieces of fibers are broken off, so they're actually a little bit below the surface. But I'll continue to sand a little bit more, and hopefully I can get rid of them. So here's the bowl with the recess cut in the rim. It's about 3/4 of an inch wide and 3/8 of an inch deep. And I bought these gears on Wish. You can see them here. I'm going to place these around the rim. They'll be glued in place, and then epoxy will be put over top of them. So now I have the gears placed around the rim. I just wanted to see how they fit in there. And now I'm just going to take some super glue and glue them in, because these will float when I pour the resin in, so I want to glue them down. I'm not going to take a lot of glue, just enough so that they don't float, because the glue will show up through the epoxy and make the epoxy look a little cloudy. The epoxy I'm going to pour in here is going to be a clear epoxy, so I don't want any of the glue to show through. So here it is. All the gears are glued in, just kind of randomly placed. Some of the gears are engaged, some are not. So they are glued, so that will prevent them from floating. So I'm just going to let the glue dry for a few hours, and then we'll pour the epoxy in. So now I'm going to get ready to pour the epoxy into the recess that was cut into the rim. This epoxy that I bought at Michael's. It was on sale at the time. And I'm going to mix it up and pour it into here. What I did was determine how much epoxy I needed. I poured rice into it to fill this up, and then just measured the rice. It gives you a good indication of how much epoxy you're going to require. So I've done that, so I'm going to mix it up. One important thing when you're mixing epoxy is make sure you follow the directions exactly for the resin that you have. Resins are different as far as how much hardener they need versus resin, so just make sure that you follow the directions exactly. This resin called for equal percentages of hardener versus resin, and equal by volume, not by weight. I made that mistake the last time I used this, but it is by volume, not by weight. This epoxy is a slow set and has good degassing capabilities, which means the air bubbles will be able to rise to the surface. But just in case, I'm going to run a torch over it. The torch heats up the air bubbles and causes them to collapse so that the air bubbles will no longer be in the epoxy. So the good news is that none of my gears are floated, so that's good. Now I'm just going to take a torch, and I'm slowly going to pass it over the surface. The torch just heats up any air bubbles that might be in the epoxy and causes them to collapse. Once the epoxy sets, any air bubbles that are left in it will always be visible and will stick out like a sore thumb. So it's worth the time now to make sure that you get rid of them. So this is dried now cured, for 48 hours. So I think it should be fine now to start turning it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn away this rim here, which will expose the edge of the epoxy here. I'm also going to turn this rim, this edge down as well to expose that. Now you can see that the epoxy that was full, so it did shrink. Some of it also leaked out. You can see it just came through here a little bit. You can see it dark in there, so I'll clean that up, and a little bit here on the outside edge where it came through. So I did lose some there, but it also shrinks. I do have one area I'm a little concerned about. I don't know if you can see it right here. This gear actually had a nut on the top of it. Makes for a nice little feature, but it also makes it a little higher than the rest. Now it is covered, there's no bump there. I've got more than enough epoxy over top of it. But what I don't want to have happen is, as I bevel this rim, which I will because I'll be turning this rim down and this rim down, I'm going to try and maintain all the height through here because I do not want to expose that in any way. But other than that, I think it turned out very well. So I'll go ahead and mount this on the lathe and start turning it down. So here I am. I'm just going to turn away that outer edge of the recess, which will expose the edge of the epoxy. There, I had a little catch near the rim, unfortunately, but I've been able to get rid of that now, and I've blended this in quite nicely here from the rim to the bowl, and now I'm just going to have to sand that a little bit. I'm not going to do a lot of sanding, especially with a coarse sanding out here on the rim. I will touch it up with some fine sanding once I get to that point, but this flat surface here for now, I'm going to not hit it with the sandpaper. I'll just concentrate on the wood part, both here on this side of the rim and this side, and then we'll deal with the actual rim itself. Good news is I didn't do anything to this surface right here, so that one gear that had the nut attached to it did not get exposed. So that's good news. So now you can see the gears in the rim, and I've sanded this down with epoxy. You've got to sand it to some pretty fine grit. So I wet sanded it down to 3000 grit, and I've still got a couple scratches on it that I want to work out. Right, I don't know if you can see it, but right there's a little tiny bit. Right there. So I'm just going to continue, some of this dust, I'm just going to continue to wet sand that a little bit more, and then I'm going to take it over to the lathe on my buffing wheel, which with some buffing compound just to remove any fine scratches after that. So I have the Beal waxing system here, and it's got a Canuba wax and some polishing stones. So this is a very, very fine grit in a wax, so it does some sanding and also applies a wax finish. So to load this up, I just turn it on, hold this against the wheel, and that'll load up my buffing wheel, and then pull up against it. So here's the finished product. So you can see the gears on top of the bowl. It's got a very nice shine to it. I ended up polishing the inside of the bowl with the same wax wheels that I did the epoxy with, and gave it a nice shine. But yeah, that's the finished product. And if you liked it, please provide a comment. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate that. And stay tuned for the next one.